Hi, I'm Canon Kathleen McNellis here at the Bosque Center with Father Brian Taylor, and we're going to have a conversation about the materials on blessing of same-gender relationships that were prepared by the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. Father Brian worked on the Theological Task Force as part of the Standing Commission's development of their response to the request from General Convention. We understand that if Resolution C-056 is approved by the 2012 General Convention, Bishop Vono will be authorizing the use of same-gender blessings in our diocese, and he will work with a council of advice that is both theologically as well as geographically broad to work out the details of how this will take place in the diocese. So before General Convention takes up its debate and votes on these materials this coming summer, Bishop Vono would very much like members of our diocese to become informed about what these materials consist of. Brian, what was the original charge given to the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music by the General Convention 3 years ago?
Well, I'll get to that in one moment, but I want to emphasize that this didn't just come up at the last General Convention. It's something that's been coming for 35 years. In 1976 was the first resolution of General Convention, affirming that homosexual persons are children of God and entitled to the full liturgical and pastoral ministrations of the Church. And in 2000, again, there was another series of resolutions, and it's been coming for some time. So in 2009, what happened is the General Convention passed a resolution that stated that it was time for a renewed pastoral response from this church, I'm quoting, and for an open process for the consideration of theological and liturgical resources for the blessing of same-gender relationships. And specifically, they asked the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, in consultation with the House of Bishops, to collect and develop theological and liturgical resources and report to the next General Convention. And to do this in an open process that would involve a lot of consultation and input and critique as they did the work over the 3-year triennium between these two conventions. The materials that were prepared over the 3-year time by the Standing Commission had 4 parts to them, which you can see in the report. And the first of those is a theological background of what do we say we're doing when we bless, and what is a covenanted relationship, and what are some of the biblical considerations to be taken into account. A second section is the liturgy itself, a liturgy of blessing. A third one is a pastoral section, which has 2 parts. One is the preparation of a couple for a same-gender blessing ceremony, and the other is a course for the congregation to go through a discussion guide for them to be able to look at these materials. And the fourth area is looking at canonical and civil considerations. And so there was a lot of work that was done by approximately 30 members, different experts, and people in these various fields that the Commission drew in for this project.
Brian, there's concern in some congregations and with some of the clergy in the diocese that should this resolution pass, that it will be mandatory for clergy as well as congregations to offer same-gender blessings. Could you kind of explain that just a little bit?
Well, Bishop Vono has already made it quite clear in a number of different settings, and to the Council of Advice that is working with him on this, as to how we bring this forward in the diocese, that no one will be required to celebrate these rites, and no congregation will be required to have them in their liturgical life. However, it will be available for those who discern that this is the right thing for their congregation, and for clergy who feel that they want to go forward with these, with the bishop's blessing. The materials that are provided, I should say though, however, the pastoral materials for congregational discussion groups, part of the reason they've been prepared is for many of those congregations throughout the Episcopal Church that are not yet certain as to whether or not they want to use them, or those that might know that they're not going to use them but want to understand what our church is doing with these rites. And so the discussion guide is made for those congregations that are discerning whether or not to go forward with them, that perhaps already know they're going to, those that know they're not going to, or those that are simply curious about what the church is up to. So I think regardless of where a congregation or an individual clergy person stands on this, some of the materials will be very useful for a congregation to engage around this issue and look at it and do some discernment work.
Brian, another concern that we hear frequently is the question of the kinds of relationships we are proposing to bless in the church. What is the intention of these materials in this regard?
That's one of the most frequently asked questions about these materials. And to answer that, I have to go back to the year 2000 when General Convention passed a resolution. The number is D039 for those of you that might want to look it up. And that was a resolution that stated that we're in disagreement about whether or not the church can approve homosexual relationships, committed relationships, and it recognized that these relationships exist in the life of the church. And where these relationships do exist, General Convention said in resolution D039 that these relationships would be characterized by fidelity, monogamy, mutual affection and respect, careful, honest communication, and the holy love which shall enable us to see in each other the image of God. This language taken from that resolution in 2000 guided the work of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music in all the work we did, because we understood this to be the voice of General Convention from over a decade ago that was stating these are the kinds of same-gender relationships that we are proposing to bless. What happens also is that we are asking the couple who are preparing for a ceremony to sign a declaration of intention in the same way that heterosexual couples who are preparing for marriage are required by canon law to sign a very similar declaration of intention. And that language is in the declaration of intention for same-gender couples, quoted word for word. And so it's a very specific expectation that these are going to be lifelong relationships of fidelity and monogamy and mutual respect and holy love. And so that really went into the work that was done in terms of our theological understanding of these kinds of relationships and the liturgy itself.
Brian, these issues are controversial, and I think we're all curious to know how you would approach some of the theological and biblical interpretation issues that were presented in your deliberations.
There was a theological task force which I served on of the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, and we worked very hard with about 10 of us, including scholars, a couple of bishops, and parish clergy like me and others, who looked at the theological material that had been produced over the last 35 years or so. There have been many books and articles written, of course, on this. And the way we approached it was that we assumed that what we were looking for is theological background that would support the celebration of same-gender relationships. Not to look at the full range of pros and cons, but to look for theological support for this, because that's what was asked by General Convention of us in doing this. And so the way we framed this is we said that, first of all, theologically speaking, we started with mission. Anyone who has seen a successful, loving relationship of marriage knows what an effect that has on many other people, not only children and other relatives, but also faith communities, parishes, friends, and how devastating it can be when a marriage falls apart, when there's a divorce. And so clearly our relationships have effects on others. So we started with that assumption that a loving relationship that shows the love of God in Christ in a couple, whether it's heterosexual or same gender, has a missional component. And in fact, that blessing is something that God does, has always done, all the way back through the Old Testament. We looked through the Old and New Testaments on this, that blessing is something that God does. First of all, we don't perform it, God blesses, in order that we not just feel blessed, but in order that we carry out the work that God has given us to do in the world. We are blessed in order to be a blessing for others. And so we really looked at that in terms of a holy covenant relationship and what other kinds of covenants throughout Scripture and throughout our tradition lead us into a missional type of lifestyle. Secondly, we looked at the relationship between Christian unity and our differences biblically in terms of how we understand these materials biblically that are often brought up on this issue. And the conclusion was that there are many things that can divide us in Scripture itself. And there are many things that have divided the church over years past, such as slavery and usury and economic exploitation of people, the role of women in society, all sorts of subjects. Those have been at various times in our history of the church divisive. One of the first divisions was whether or not Gentiles would be considered part of the church, whether they had to take on Jewish dietary laws and so forth. And so the important thing was, how did the church deal historically, biblically, historically, with our differences? And the conclusion we came to was that the more important things that unite us are the things that have held the church together and always will. The revelation of Christ, the love of God, the redemption of the world. These are foundational things that the church has always held to, that all people can agree on, and that the more divisive issues sometimes change through history. And yet, through all of this, it is our unity that is more important, even for those who profoundly disagree. And our prayer is that people of this diocese, people throughout the Episcopal Church, will be able to agree to disagree on some issues, this being one of them, and to still live together in respect and in worship and in ministry, most of all.
Some states allow same-gender marriage or civil unions, or legislation that prevents same-gender marriages or civil unions. New Mexico doesn't have legislation that allows or prevents either. And Texas has a Defense of Marriage Act that prohibits both. Brian, could you explain these rites of blessing in our diocese and how that would be effective?
Well, this is a very complex issue depending on the state in which one resides, but unfortunately we had some really good canon lawyers and civil lawyers who were able to advise us on this and form that task group. The upshot of it all, however, is very simple, and that is that we are doing blessings here. And because of the protection of the First Amendment of our Constitution, the government is prevented from prohibiting the free exercise of religion. What that means is that they don't have any jurisdiction over what the church decides to do in terms of blessings. And so regardless of the state one is in, the church is free to offer blessings.
Let's talk about the liturgy of blessing itself. As Anglicans, we know that concern for specifics, for quality, for good theology, is very important to us, and many of the newer liturgies sometimes seem trendy, and don't have the gravity that comes with time. Brian, could you describe for us the liturgy of blessing itself?
What you're saying is true. We've all been to weddings where the words of the ceremony were made up by the couple, and we've all cringed as we sat there and listened, and we Anglicans care about such things. One of the things that I think has been a nice surprise for people who have listened to the rite as it's been read in various presentations is the quality, the liturgical quality. And the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music actually put out a list of qualities that they took into consideration in writing the language. And let me just share some of them with you. And these were things they identified as typically Anglican characteristics of liturgy. And one can think about the prayer book and the book of occasional services and other rites that we have authorized. It has high literary value. It is beautiful language. It uses the recurring structures, linguistic patterns, and metaphors of the prayer book. It is formal, not casual, conversational, or colloquial. It has a ritual or sacred register. It is dense enough to carry the freight of the sacred purpose for which it was intended. It's metaphoric without being obtuse, and this is the last one that's very interesting. It is performative, and that is to say it actually believes that what we are saying happens in the liturgy. It's language that is active. It's not just talking about God and how wonderful things are. It's asking for something to happen, and it expects that something will happen in the liturgy itself. And the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music used these principles, which are traditional as Episcopalians, in the writing of these rites, but they also took in hundreds of examples of rites that have been used in various places, both in the United States and Canada, as well as elsewhere. They took in lots of suggested rites that people had written themselves. The Diocese of Vermont has been using one for many years, and they subjected these to really close scrutiny and took some of the best of these things, as well as writing some of their own portions.
The heart of the liturgy for many is the vows and the pronouncement. Can you give us a preview?
I'd be happy to. Keep in mind, however, that these are proposed rites, and the General Convention could conceivably edit them if they pass them. And if they are passed as well, we have to keep in mind that these are trial use, and there will be a period of time for at least 3 years over the next triennium when there will be suggested edits and feedback on the use of these rites so that they can be put in some more final form at the next General Convention in 2015. But as they stand currently, the couple, when they make their commitment, and it's called commitment rather than vows, say this: in the name of God, I give myself to you. I will support and care for you by the grace of God, enduring all things, bearing all things. I will hold and cherish you in the love of Christ, in times of plenty, in times of want. I will honor and keep you with the Spirit's help, forsaking all others, as long as we both shall live. This is my solemn vow. And then, after the couple have exchanged vows and rings, if rings are used, the priest says, inasmuch as, name and name, have exchanged vows of love and fidelity in the presence of God and the Church, I now pronounce that they are bound to one another in a holy covenant, as long as they both shall live. So, a couple of things to point out. One is that it's being called a covenant. Secondly is that the vows are for a lifelong covenant, and for a covenant that is characterized by fidelity and by monogamy and by mutual love of the kind of unconditional sort that is expected of Christian covenanted relationships.
Brian, is there anything else you'd like to highlight for us?
Well, just a reminder that the bishop is currently working with the Council of Advice to talk about how to approach this in the diocese. There will be a vote on this and debate at General Convention, so this is all assuming that it passes, and we don't know that yet, but if it passes, the Council of Advice will work with the bishop in terms of how it will go forward in the diocese. The earliest date that it could be used in any church of the Episcopal Church is Advent of this year, but the bishop and the Council of Advice will be talking about timing. Congregations that are considering moving ahead with this or just want to be educated more about it can use materials that are provided by this resolution that are congregational discussion guides. There also may be other material that the bishop and Council of Advice wish to put forward for congregations to utilize in the preparation. And as the bishop and the Council of Advice make materials available, they will be posted on the diocesan website and probably available in other means as well.